The night I dug beneath the rosemary bush, I didn't find soil or roots. I found a sealed glass bottle, packed with money, false IDs, and a letter that shattered everything I thought I knew about my husband. For years, I had watched him bury those bottles under the full moon, believing his stories about old family traditions. But under that cold starlight, I realized I had been living beside a stranger. If stories like this stir your heart, I'd be honored if you subscribed or left a comment. I do read them all. Tell me, what would you have felt standing there with that bottle in your hands? May peace and gentleness be with you tonight. I was 86 when I finally found the courage to speak it aloud, and even now the words carry a weight that makes my breath slow. I spent most of my life in a small Midwestern town, the kind of place where everyone knows who you are, what you bake for the church potluck, and how many times your husband's car pulls into the driveway each week. The winters came long and white. The summers were heavy with cicadas, and life moved with a rhythm as steady as the courthouse clock in the center of town. It was there, in that quiet corner of America, that I learned the unsettling truth that a home, no matter how tidy it looks from the street, can harbor secrets that grow like weeds beneath the soil. Frank was the kind of man people noticed when he walked into a room. Tall, handsome, always in a crisp suit and polished shoes, he had a salesman's smile that could light up a conversation before a word was spoken. When we met in the mid-1960s, I was 27, a young schoolteacher with chalk dust on my skirts and more books than dresses. He came to the schoolhouse to enroll his nephew, or so he said, though sometimes I wondered later if that had only been an excuse to meet me. He spoke of traveling across the state, of shaking hands with business owners and bringing them products they didn't know they needed, of hotels in Chicago and diners along the interstate. For a girl who had never left her county, his stories felt like windows into a bigger world, and before long I had stepped fully into his orbit. 6 months later, I was his wife. The first years of our marriage felt like a dream, stitched together from magazine pages. We had a small house with white shutters and a patch of grass out back, and Frank would return from his trips with trinkets he claimed to pick up along the way: a silk scarf from St. Louis, a book of poems from Kansas City, a music box from Nashville that played Blue Moon with a tinny sweetness. He listened to me talk about my students as though each story mattered, and when Richard was born in 1967, he held our son with a tenderness that melted me. By the time our daughter Laura arrived in 1970, I believed we were the picture of a fortunate American family. I told myself that the late nights and the long absences were simply the price of his ambition. It was on one of those nights in the late 1960s when everything began to shift. I had always been a light sleeper, and with a newborn in the house, my ears stayed tuned to every creak of the floorboards. That night, I woke suddenly, the clock on the dresser glowing 2:17 a.m. The other side of the bed was empty. At first I thought Frank had gone to the kitchen for water, but when I whispered his name into the darkness, no answer came. I rose quietly, the wooden floor cool under my bare feet, and followed the faint draft that seeped through the hallway. The back door was ajar, letting in a ribbon of moonlight that stretched across the linoleum. Through the kitchen window I saw him. He was in the backyard, crouched low, the pale silver of the moon illuminating the sharp lines of his face. He wore gloves, the kind he usually saved for raking leaves, and in his hands was a small shovel. At his side sat a dark glass bottle, empty, waiting. I watched, unable to move, as he dug a neat hole, lowered the bottle inside with an almost reverent care, then covered it again, smoothing the dirt flat as if erasing every trace of what had been hidden. His movements were deliberate, practiced, not the fumbling of a man acting on impulse, but the ritual of someone following instructions older than himself. I slipped back to bed before he returned, heart pounding like a girl caught spying where she shouldn't. When the mattress dipped under his weight and he laid his arm over me, I forced my breath to steady, pretending to be asleep. But inside my chest, questions burned. What had I just witnessed? The next morning, while pouring his coffee, I asked lightly where he had gone in the night. For just a second, his eyes flickered. Surprise, maybe even alarm. But then he smiled that charming smile and chuckled. You noticed? Forgive me, sweetheart. It's just a family tradition, something my grandfather taught me. We bury bottles during the full moon to invite prosperity, a little superstition from the old country. The men have done it for generations. His tone was calm, convincing, as though the whole thing were a harmless quirk. He even added, later that afternoon, a sprig of rosemary above the spot, saying it was meant to guard the blessing. I wanted to believe him. After all, he had given me no reason to doubt. He worked hard, he provided, he loved his children, and if he had some eccentric habit under the moonlight, who was I to question it? In those years, wives were taught not to pry into their husbands' affairs. My own mother used to say, "Every marriage has its little mysteries, Helen. Best to leave them be." So I tried. I tried to leave it be. But I could not ignore what my eyes had seen, nor the feeling that pressed against my ribs whenever the moon grew round. Because Frank did it again, and again. Always on those nights when the sky was swollen with light, I would hear the soft click of the back door, the whisper of the shovel against the earth, and when I looked out from the shadows of our bedroom window, I would see him kneeling there, burying another bottle as though planting a seed only he understood. Each time, my unease grew sharper, and though I told myself it was nothing more than a family charm, a simple act of hope for fortune, I could not shake the sense that something more was being buried in that soil, something I was not meant to see. And so, while our neighbours slept and the town rested under its blanket of quiet, I stood in silence at the window, watching my husband repeat his secret ritual, the glint of glass vanishing into the earth under the watchful glow of the full Midwestern moon. It began subtly, almost beautifully, as though Frank were tending not a secret, but a garden of devotion. Every time he went out beneath the full moon, digging carefully into the dark soil and lowering another glass bottle, he would press a sprig of something green into the earth above it. Basil at first, with its peppery scent that clung to the summer air. Then rosemary, needles sharp and fragrant, leaning stiffly toward the sky. Later, mint that crept in wide, unruly patches until the back garden smelled fresh enough to flavour tea for the whole neighbourhood. To anyone else, it might have looked like a man with a fondness for herbs, a simple hobby. To me, it felt like each plant was a marker, a living gravestone for whatever secrets he had buried in the glass beneath. One evening, I caught him inside the house before he made his midnight trip outdoors. The children were asleep. The television hummed softly in the living room, and Frank sat at the kitchen table with a bottle before him. He handled it with a precision that made me pause in the doorway, my hand resting lightly on the frame. Inside, folded as neat as origami, were small slips of paper. He bent over them, writing, then folding, sliding each one into the bottle as though sealing away private thoughts. When he noticed me, his shoulders stiffened. He stood quickly, capping the bottle, slipping on that easy smile. Just notes from clients. he said, brushing past me with a kiss on the forehead. A little superstition, sweetheart. Nothing for you to worry about. His voice was smooth, convincing, but his eyes didn't linger in mine the way they usually did. I told myself to believe him. After all, hadn't he always provided? Hadn't he always been the one neighbours admired for his good suits and his steady job? The father who brought home toys after long trips away? Yet a hollow feeling began to settle in me, a quiet throb of unease I couldn't push away. Nights passed. Full moons waxed and waned, and each time Frank slipped out with his gloves and shovel, another herb took root in the yard. Our garden was no longer just a backyard. It had become a map of secrets, fragrant and green, but shadowed with questions I dared not ask aloud. The early 1970s rolled forward with the same mixture of blessings and shadows. Richard, my oldest, was in elementary school by then, quick with numbers, eager to race through his math homework and show it proudly to Frank when he returned from trips. Laura, our spirited little girl, loved to follow me to school, chattering endlessly about the books on my desk and asking when she could be old enough to teach like me. On the surface, we looked like any family in our Midwestern town. Sunday dinners with fried chicken and cornbread, holiday parades down Main Street, evenings spent around the radio or television. But under those ordinary rhythms, I felt the tug of something I couldn't name. Sometimes I would stand at the sink, washing dishes, and glance out to see the gardens swaying with herbs, each stalk a reminder that my husband's hands were planting more than vegetables. Then came the night I found the note. It was 1974, a year that brought both change and the first undeniable crack in the picture we presented to the world. I had been folding laundry in our bedroom, stacking Frank's pressed shirts and trousers, when my fingers brushed against the stiff corner of paper tucked in the pocket of his grey vest. I pulled it free, expecting a receipt or business card, but instead saw a neat, elegant script written in ink that carried a faint floral scent. I miss you. Thursday, same time. With love, Isabel. My breath stopped. My knees weakened, and I had to sit on the edge of the bed, staring at those words until they blurred. Isabel. Who was she? A client? A colleague? Or something else entirely? That night, I could hardly swallow my supper. Richard spoke proudly of a school project. Laura begged for a second slice of pie, and Frank laughed easily, carving roast beef as though our table were the most solid ground in the world. But every time I looked at him, all I saw was the folded slip of paper burning in my apron pocket, the graceful loop of a stranger's handwriting calling to him with affection. My smile felt frozen, brittle as porcelain. I excused myself early, claiming a headache, though the real ache was deeper, lodged in a place I couldn't touch. Sleep eluded me. I lay in bed listening to the tick of the clock, the rustle of leaves against the siding, the sound of Frank's steady breathing beside me. How could a man rest so easily, I wondered, when I was tangled in fear and doubt? My mind circled the possibilities, each one darker than the last. Perhaps it was innocent, perhaps it was nothing more than business. But the tone of that note, the tenderness, the secrecy, it was not business. It was intimacy. And suddenly, the bottles in the garden seemed heavier, darker, each one containing not prosperity, but pieces of a truth I was only beginning to glimpse. The following week, I went through the motions of daily life as though nothing had changed. I graded papers, greeted parents at school conferences, hung laundry on the line. Neighbours waved, children laughed. The town carried on in its small, predictable way. But inside, I was different. I caught myself studying Frank's face across the dinner table. searching for signs of betrayal in the curve of his smile, in the set of his jaw. I watched how he reached for his coffee cup, how he adjusted his tie, how he left his suitcase near the door when he claimed he was only home for a night. Everything ordinary now looked like performance, rehearsed and precise. I could no longer sit still with only suspicions. One evening, when the sun had dropped low and the shadows grew long across our street, I made up my mind. I would follow him. I would see with my own eyes what my husband did when he disappeared into the night. As I closed the curtains and turned off the lights, my heart pounded with both fear and resolve. The garden lay quiet, herbs trembling in the wind, waiting. Somewhere beneath their roots, Frank's bottles lay buried, their secrets pressing upward through the soil. And I knew the time had come to dig for the truth, not with a shovel, but with my own two eyes. The night I chose to follow Frank, the air was thick with summer heat, heavy enough that the street lamps seemed to buzz louder than usual, as though the whole town were holding its breath. I wore a simple dress he hadn't seen me in for years, a scarf knotted low over my hair, and sunglasses that looked too dark for evening, but gave me the courage of disguise. At the bus stop, I kept to the shadows of a cafe's awning, pretending to study a newspaper I couldn't bring myself to read. My heart thudded in a way that made me feel far younger and far older all at once, as if I were both a nervous schoolgirl and a weary wife. When Frank stepped off the bus, his suit pressed sharp, his shoes catching the glow of the streetlight, I knew in an instant that I was right to be afraid. He didn't walk toward the offices downtown, as he always claimed. Instead, his stride was purposeful, angled toward a quieter part of the city, where brick apartments lined narrow streets and laundry fluttered in the warm evening breeze. I followed at a careful distance, crossing only when others crossed, pausing to examine storefront windows as though I were simply a passerby. After 15 minutes, he stopped before a tall apartment building with iron railings and wide marble steps, and greeted the doorman with the easy familiarity of someone who had been there many times before. My breath caught as I pressed closer to a lamppost, shielding myself behind a newsstand stacked with magazines. Moments later, she appeared. Isabel. A woman of striking presence, her hair dark and glossy, swept back into an elegant twist at the nape of her neck. She wore a pale blue dress that clung softly to her figure, and pearl earrings that glimmered in the fading light. She carried herself with quiet refinement, every step measured. Her chin lifted with a composure that told me she belonged to a world far different from mine. She smiled faintly as she joined Frank, her eyes warm, her movements gentle but intimate. They stood close enough that the connection between them was unmistakable, yet careful enough that an onlooker might not accuse them of anything improper. I watched as they spoke, their voices too low to hear, but their gestures betrayed them. The way Isabel reached to smooth the edge of his tie, the way Frank leaned slightly toward her, his expression softer than I had seen in years, told me what no words could. My legs trembled, as though the earth itself had shifted beneath me. I wanted to shout, to storm across the street, to demand the truth. But instead, I remained still, my hands gripping the newspaper so tightly it tore at the edges. For nearly 3 hours I lingered nearby, pacing the block, returning again and again to that vantage point, each minute confirming what my heart already knew. When Frank finally emerged from the building, Isabel walked him to the door, her hand brushing lightly against his sleeve. They parted without a kiss, without the embrace one might expect. But the intimacy was undeniable. That single glance they shared as he turned away carried more weight than any embrace could. I hurried home before him, slipping inside just in time to stir the pot on the stove, to make the house smell of supper, so it seemed I had never left. And when he returned with his well-practiced smile, spinning tales of a long meeting with clients, I nodded and smiled back, though my heart was as cold and heavy as stone. In the months that followed, I lived as two people, the dutiful mother and teacher by day, and the silent keeper of a terrible truth by night. Richard and Laura grew, their laughter filling the house, their small triumphs, spelling tests, art projects, scraped knees, demanding my attention and love. To them, their father was still the man who carried home gifts, who told stories of far-off towns, who bent low to kiss their foreheads before bedtime. I let them keep that illusion, even as mine had crumbled. At church socials and school gatherings, I smiled beside him, shaking hands, accepting compliments, my voice steady, while inside me the questions swirled like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Then, in the autumn of 1974, the storm broke. The phone rang late one afternoon as I was correcting papers at the kitchen table. Richard worked on his homework nearby. Laura sprawled on the rug colouring with crayons. The voice on the line was calm, professional. Dr. Matthews from the county hospital downtown. He asked for me by name, and in those few moments before he spoke again, I felt the world teeter on a knife's edge. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Whitaker," he said gently. "Your husband was brought in an hour ago. It was a heart attack. We tried everything we could. He didn't survive." I remember the silence that followed, heavy and unrelenting, before the sounds of the room crept back in. The scratch of Richard's pencil, Laura humming as she filled her page with colour. My body moved on instinct, gathering my purse, calling for a neighbour to watch the children, walking to the hospital as though through a dream. Frank lay there, motionless, his features calm, as if he had simply drifted to sleep. But the nurse's words cut deeper than any sight could. He hadn't been on a business trip in Chicago or St. Louis, as he told me. He had collapsed in a downtown hotel, just blocks from the hospital, and he had not been alone. A woman, unidentified, had called for help when he fell. I stood over him, my heart breaking and hardening all at once. Even in death, he had clung to his deception. I thought of Isabel's graceful figure at the apartment door, the soft way she touched his tie, the warmth in her eyes. My knees nearly gave way, and I had to steady myself on the edge of the gurney, forcing my tears back for the sake of dignity. There were papers to sign, forms to complete, relatives to call. The rituals of death leave little space for the grief itself. The funeral came quickly, blur of black clothes, folded hands, and murmured condolences. Neighbours brought casseroles. Colleagues pressed my hand with rehearsed words. And I endured it all with a calm face that felt carved from wood. Richard clung to my skirt. Laura asked again and again when her father would come home, and I whispered answers I barely believed myself. In the corner of the chapel, I saw her, the same woman from that apartment, Isabel. She stood back, dressed in black, eyes lowered, her presence both brazen and sorrowful. Our gazes met for only a moment before she turned and slipped away, vanishing into the crowd as though she were a shadow. When the service ended and the mourners drifted back to their lives, I returned to our house, heavy with silence. I thought the worst was behind me, that the heartbreak of betrayal and the finality of death were the end of Frank's story in my life. But grief has a way of peeling back layers, revealing truths far crueler than those first blows. It was only when I sat at the kitchen table days later, bills spread before me, that I learned how deeply his deceptions had rooted themselves. The house was mortgaged, our finances precarious, debts I had never known about stacked high against us. And out the back window, the moon shone down upon the garden, where rows of herbs swayed above the buried bottles. Those bottles, his ritual, his secrets, his legacy, were now all that remained. The night the moon rose full, its pale light washing the yard in silver, I felt the weight of a choice pressing so hard against my chest that I could barely breathe. For years, I had watched Frank kneel under that same moonlight, burying bottles in the soil with hands gloved like a thief's, yet I had never dared disturb them. But now, the quiet house behind me felt heavy with debts and lies, the children sleeping innocently in their rooms, while I paced the kitchen floor with a lantern in my hand. Finally, I slipped on my gardening boots, wrapped a shawl around my shoulders, and stepped into the cool night air, every creak of the porch boards echoing louder than my conscience would have liked. I chose the patch of ground marked by the oldest herb, an overgrown clump of basil, its scent sharp even in the darkness. Kneeling down, my fingers trembled as I pressed the spade into the earth, the sound of metal slicing soil strangely loud in the silence of the yard. Sweat trickled down my temples, though the night was cool, and every thrust of the spade felt like a betrayal, as though I were violating the resting place of a man I had once loved. Then came the hollow clink, the sound of glass against steel. My breath caught, and I dug more carefully until my hands closed around the neck of a bottle, slick with damp soil and sealed with wax the colour of dried blood. Carrying it back to the porch, I sat beneath the lantern's glow and broke the seal with unsteady fingers. Inside, wrapped tight in oilcloth, were papers and a bundle of cash so thick I could barely close my hand around it. At first, I thought my eyes deceived me. The name on the identification card was not Frank Whitaker, husband and father, but Anthony Smith, born in a town I had never heard of, his parents listed as strangers. Yet the face staring back at me from the photograph was undeniably his. Tucked alongside the ID was a list of properties, complete with addresses and notations, except these were no ordinary records. The words sold, transferred, investors fooled leapt from the page, each one a dagger in my chest. My husband, it seemed, had built a career not in commerce, but in deception. I closed the bottle, pushing it aside as nausea washed over me, but the compulsion to know more gnawed too fiercely to ignore. Within days, when the children were at school and neighbours gone about their business, I returned to the garden. One by one, I unearthed more bottles, each sealed with wax, each planted beneath rosemary, mint, or thyme. And with every bottle came another truth, darker than the last. There were ledgers filled with careful notes about schemes to sell plots of land that did not exist, lists of men and women tricked out of their savings, names crossed out as though they were casualties in a war I hadn't known my husband was waging. Stacks of bills in varying amounts were tucked between the pages, their edges brittle and damp, but still potent reminders of a life lived on the edge of the law. Then came the one that changed everything. Inside a larger bottle, beneath a flourishing rosemary bush, I found documents not just of fraud, but of escape. There were tickets booked under the name Anthony Smith, one bound for Montevideo, Uruguay. Accompanying them were bank slips detailing planned transfers to an account overseas, and a letter addressed not to me, but to Isabel. Her name written in his hand, flowing and affectionate, was enough to still my breath. The letter spoke of a future prepared for the two of them, a life free of burdens and pretense, a chance to leave behind the shadows of lies, as he called them, though those shadows were the very walls of our marriage, the final lines cut deepest of all. My marriage, he wrote, has served its purpose, a respectable front for the years we needed it. But soon I will be free, and so will you. We will live honestly at last, only you and me. Those words, cruel in their clarity, stripped the years of comfort, laughter, and shared memories down to a hollow shell. I sat frozen on the porch, the bottle between my knees, the night pressing in around me. Even the crickets seemed to fall silent, as if the earth itself recoiled from the truth laid bare. In the days that followed, I continued to dig. Each bottle confirmed the pattern, each one a piece of the puzzle that revealed my husband not as the man I believed him to be, but as a master of masks. There were careful maps of towns where he had run schemes, photographs of unfamiliar faces with notes scribbled beside them. Easy target, too cautious, paid in full. I found receipts from banks in cities he claimed never to have visited, all tied to the name Anthony Smith. And always, always, her name, Isabel, woven through like a refrain in a song I never chose to hear. At night, I lay awake listening to the children breathe, wondering how much of their father's shadow would cling to them when they were grown. By day, I went about the routines of teaching, cooking, and tending the house. But beneath every motion simmered the knowledge that my life had been nothing more than a stage set for his performance. It was not just infidelity, not just betrayal. It was that my entire marriage had been constructed as camouflage, a convenient illusion to lend credibility to a man intent on deceiving the world. And yet, amid the heartbreak, there lay something undeniable: the money. Stacks of bills, bundled in wax paper, hidden for years beneath the herbs of our garden, now sat in a trunk at the back of my closet. Enough to pay off debts, enough to keep the roof above Richard and Laura, enough to buy time in a world that rarely gives it freely. I stared at those bills by lamplight, torn between revulsion and relief, wondering if accepting them would taint me with his crimes or save me from ruin. One evening, as the moon rose full once more, I stood in the yard and let the cool night air wash over me. The garden, once a place of beauty, now felt like a cemetery of secrets, each plant a headstone marking deceit. My hands were stained with soil, my heart with betrayal, and still, I knew I would return to those bottles until every last secret was unearthed. Because only by facing the full weight of his lies could I begin to carve a future from their ruins. And so I stood there, clutching the final letter I had found, the ink smudged by my tears, the paper soft from my trembling grip. The truth was undeniable. The man I married had never truly been mine, our life together nothing more than a carefully constructed veil. Yet in the cruelest twist, the very fruits of his deception, the cash, the documents, the hidden treasures, were now the only things that might keep my children safe. My marriage had been a facade, but survival might be built upon its ashes. The money I unearthed from those bottles felt tainted in my hands, as if the bills themselves carried the scent of betrayal. Yet they were also the lifeline I needed. With trembling resolve, I took the bundles to the bank, clearing the debts that had hung like a storm cloud above my head, paying off the mortgage that threatened to strip away the only shelter left for my children and me. Signing those papers with the knowledge that the house was finally safe brought tears to my eyes, not of joy, but of relief so raw it nearly buckled my knees. For the first time since Frank's death, I felt the faint stirrings of something that might resemble control, the sense that perhaps I could shape a future not defined by his lies, but by my own choices. At first, I kept the remaining money locked away, unsure whether I could stomach touching it. But the reality of two growing children, school fees, and the daily cost of bread and milk left little room for pride. Slowly, cautiously, I began to use it, not for luxury, but for survival. And then, one morning, as I stood in town, I passed a small vacant storefront, its windows dusty, its wooden door weathered but inviting. A thought took root inside me, a place of my own, a way to build something honest from the wreckage. Within weeks, the lease was signed, shelves were hammered into place by a kind neighbour, and I stood behind a counter stocked with notebooks, pens, and paper, my palms sweating as the first customers walked in. The shop began modestly, just school supplies and stationery, but word spread, and so did the idea that I might add books. Children from the school where I once taught wandered in after class, their eyes wide at the rows of titles. Soon, mothers stopped by for novels, fathers for histories, students for dictionaries. One by one, the shelves filled, and the shop grew into something larger than I had dared to hope. I painted the words, "New Path," above the door myself, the brush shaking in my hand, but steady enough to mark the turning of a page in my life. Every time I unlocked that door in the morning and breathed in the scent of paper and ink, I felt as though I were writing a chapter that was truly mine. Richard, now a young man with broad shoulders and a keen mind for numbers, began to spend more time helping me in the store. He balanced the accounts, suggested ways to arrange the displays, and spoke with a confidence that reminded me of his father, though without the shadows. Laura, full of curiosity and righteous fire, often sat in the back corner with a stack of law books she had borrowed from the library, her eyes shining as she spoke of one day becoming an attorney. I watched them both with pride that softened the ache in my chest. For all the falsehoods that had marked my marriage, these children were the truth I clung to, the proof that love, once given, bore fruit that no betrayal could undo. Years passed in the steady rhythm of the shop and the growing independence of my children. Life was not easy, but it was honest, and in that honesty I found a kind of peace. Then, one autumn afternoon, as the leaves blew in golden drifts down Main Street, the bell above the door jingled, and I looked up from the counter. Standing in the doorway was Isabel. My heart jolted, my hand tightening around the ledger as if it were a shield. She was older now, her hair streaked faintly with silver, but her elegance remained. She wore a tailored coat in a soft shade of grey, gloves that fit her hands like a second skin, and a pearl brooch that caught the light as she stepped inside. Her eyes met mine, and in them I saw not triumph or arrogance, but something weary, perhaps even sorrowful. She walked slowly to the counter, her heels clicking against the wooden floor, and spoke in a voice both gentle and deliberate. "Helen," she said, her gaze steady, "I need you to know. I was deceived, too. He promised me a life, a future, but in the end, he betrayed us both." Her words were not sharp, not defensive, but they struck me like stones nonetheless. For years, I had painted her as the villain of my story, the woman who lured Frank away. But as I listened, I realized she too had been caught in his web, believing the same lies that once kept me blind. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "There are people, former partners of his, men who knew about the money, about the fraud. They may come looking. I thought you deserved to be warned." A chill spread through me, colder than any winter draft. The store around us, with its warm light and tidy shelves, suddenly felt fragile, as though the past I had buried could walk through the door at any moment, dressed not in mourning, but in menace. Isabel's eyes softened. "I don't wish you harm. I only hope you'll be careful." With that, she placed a hand briefly over mine, light, almost sisterly, then turned and walked out, her figure disappearing into the swirl of leaves on the street. I stood behind the counter long after she left, the bell above the door still ringing faintly in my ears. The weight of her words pressed heavy on me, yet beneath it there was also a strange sense of release. For years, I had feared her as a shadow looming over my life, but now I saw she had been just another woman trapped in Frank's lies. We were not enemies. We were survivors of the same storm. And as I looked around the shop I had built with my own hands, at the life I had carved from betrayal, I understood something I had not before. The past had claws, yes, and it could reach for me still. But I was no longer the timid woman peering through curtains at midnight, too afraid to question the man she loved. I was a mother who had raised 2 children into strong young adults, a woman who had faced ruin and found the will to stand again. The bottles in the yard had been filled with deception, but from them I had built a store filled with truth, each book on the shelf a reminder that stories can both wound and heal. And in that moment, I knew the past could come knocking, but it would not find me defenseless. Spring came softly that year, with rains that loosened the soil and breezes that carried the scent of lilacs down the street. One morning, I tied back my hair, pulled on a pair of gloves, and walked into the backyard with tools in hand. The herbs had grown wild, untended yet stubborn, their roots tangled deep into the earth where bottles once slept. I stood for a long time among them, remembering nights when the moonlight glinted on Frank's shovel, when I pressed my face to the glass and wondered what secrets he planted here. But now, those questions had already been unearthed, and I was left with the choice of whether to let the past keep sprouting in my soil, or to clear it away and begin again. With each pull of the rake, each cut of the shears, I tore up the herbs that had marked years of deception. Basil, rosemary, mint, all uprooted, their sharp scents rising like ghosts in the warm air. I filled sack after sack, until the yard no longer looked like a patchwork of secrets, but like bare ground waiting for something new. It was hard work, sweat running down my neck, my knees aching, but I pressed on until nothing remained but earth and possibility. The children helped where they could, carrying away bundles of roots, their laughter cutting through the heaviness, reminding me that this garden was no longer about what was hidden, but about what could grow in the open. Over the weeks that followed, I built something I could be proud of. A neighbour lent me lumber, and with Richard's strong hands, we raised a pergola, its beams painted white to catch the sun. Laura helped me choose flowers at the nursery, marigolds and petunias for summer, mums for fall, tulips and daffodils that would sleep through the winter and burst alive come spring. We placed a wooden bench beneath the pergola, its slats smooth and sturdy, a place to sit with a book or a grandchild on my lap. Where once stood shadows, now bloomed colour, and every petal that opened felt like a note of forgiveness the earth whispered back to me. One afternoon, as I cleared the last patch of soil, I found something unexpected. Buried shallow, almost as if it had been left for me to find, was a small envelope, sealed and tucked inside a rusted tin. My heart faltered. I carried it to the bench and sat, the paper trembling in my hands before I finally unfolded it. The handwriting was Frank's, steady and familiar, And as my eyes moved across the page, I felt both dread and longing. In the letter, he confessed what I had already known, that our marriage had begun as a convenient mask, a respectable front for the life he was constructing elsewhere. But then came words that unsettled me more than the lies ever had. He wrote that somewhere along the years, he had come to feel genuine affection, even love, for the life we had built, for the children, for me. I stared at those sentences until they blurred, searching for sincerity in ink that could no longer be defended by the man who wrote it. Did he mean it? Or was this just another manipulation, a final attempt to soften the sharp edges of betrayal? I would never know. I closed my eyes, breathing in the scent of the new flowers around me, and felt a calm resolve settle. Some truths cannot be proven, and some wounds cannot be healed by words scrawled on paper. Slowly, I struck a match, held the flame to the letter, and watched as the edges curled black, the words lifting into smoke and disappearing against the blue sky. That night, I gathered Richard and Laura at the kitchen table, the same table where Frank once told his stories, where lies had mingled with laughter. I told them simply, the past can hold terrible things, deceit, betrayal, pain. But what matters is not what's buried, it's what we choose to grow after. They listened with wide eyes, the weight of my words heavy but necessary, and I hoped they understood that while their father's choices had scarred us, they did not define us. The garden outside, cleared and blooming anew, was proof that we could create beauty from the soil of ruin. Years slipped by. Richard became a man steady with numbers and responsibility, standing beside me in the shop, then later managing parts of it on his own. Laura pursued her dream, studying law with a fire in her heart, determined to fight for fairness in a world that often lacked it. I watched them step into their futures with pride, each step an answer to the doubts that had once plagued me. Time softened the ache, though it never erased it, and in the evenings I would sit in the garden, the pergola wrapped in climbing roses, the air alive with the laughter of grandchildren who knew nothing of buried bottles. In those twilight years, I told my story not with bitterness, but with the quiet conviction of someone who had survived and remade herself. To my grandchildren, I would say, people may bury lies, but the ground remembers. And when those lies are unearthed, you have a choice. You can let them poison you, or you can plant something new in their place. Their eyes would widen, their hands resting on mine, and I would see in them not fear, but curiosity, the hunger to learn from what had once broken me. Now, as I sit beneath the pergola, the evening light painting the garden gold, I understand that the past will always linger, but it no longer rules me. The bottles buried in the yard held lies, but they also gave me the seeds for a new, honest life. And that, more than anything Frank ever left behind, is the legacy I choose to keep. There are stories we live through that change us forever. They leave behind not only pain, but also the quiet strength we never knew we carried. What matters is not the lies we uncover or the losses we endure, but the way we choose to keep walking, step by step, into a life shaped by honesty and love. For some, it is a garden. For others, it may be a book, a child's laughter, or the simple comfort of sitting together at the end of a long day. Whatever form it takes, it reminds us that even in the darkest chapters, there is always room to begin again. I share this story not to dwell on sorrow, but to honor resilience, the kind that belongs to every one of us who has faced disappointment, betrayal, or heartbreak. and still found the will to rise. May you carry that truth gently with you tonight. If this story has touched your heart, I'd be grateful if you'd share your thoughts below or join us by subscribing. Until we meet again, may peace and kindness find their way to your doorstep.